Little David, but Goliath steamrolling across the map. The primary aim of the conference was to develop strategies to spin unpopular Israeli policies and to counter negative press coverage by shaping the media frame in advance. News doesn't just jump into a camera, a conference delegate said. It's directed, it's managed, it's made accessible. Israel-based advertising executive Martin Fenton would put it in even more blunt terms. Propaganda is not a dirty word, he said. Face it, we are in the game of changing people's minds, of making them think differently. To accomplish that, we need propaganda.
Classic PR is to say the problem is not the policy, it's the presentation. When the policies are so reprehensible that many people become critical, rather than acknowledge there's anything wrong with the policy, there's a doubling down on the PR effort.
After Lebanon, you start to see the basic Hasbara strategy in action. Images of Palestinians fighting back against Israel's occupation make their way onto American television screens. And the Israeli military crushes this resistance in brutal ways that undercut Israel's image as underdog and victim.
Israeli helicopter gunships deliberately fired a missile into a crowd of civilians last night, killing 7 Palestinians and wounding 70 more.
Then Israeli officials go into full Hasbara mode and act like the occupation doesn't even exist, framing all Palestinian resistance as terrorism and Israeli aggression as self-defense.
We will do whatever it takes to defend ourselves, and defend ourselves we will.
The Palestinian terror campaign continues. It only justifies again and again that we, Israel, have to continue and defend ourselves.
And so this becomes the framing of the situation. Israel is defending itself, which means Israel is not the aggressor here. That doesn't square with the reality on the ground, and we know that. You have a right to defend yourself. You don't have a right to occupy people, deny them their human rights, and then cry foul when they resist. That's not the right to self-defense. That's the right to repression. That's what Israel is asking for here. Let us do away with these dissenters, these Palestinian dissenters, and call it defense.
As news media have proliferated over the years, Israel's public relations efforts have only become more and more explicit and intense.
Israel's mechanism of projecting its propaganda, or what they call Hasbara, is one of the most sophisticated arms of its government. It's a weapon of Israeli warfare.
A number of well-funded public relations organizations have emerged within the United States to help Israel justify its policies, especially the occupation and settlements, on security grounds. One of these groups is the Israel Project. In 2009, the Israel Project turned to conservative pollster and rebranding expert Frank Luntz.
Frank Luntz. This is the man that reframed the estate tax as the death tax, healthcare reform as government takeover of healthcare. Now, some critics have called Luntz a spin doctor who manipulates public emotion, but Luntz would reframe that as Fox News analyst.
The Israel Project hired him to determine which talking points used by Israeli and US officials over time have been most effective in maintaining American sympathy for Israel. Luntz wrote up his recommendations in a 2009 report called The Global Language Dictionary.
If you want to understand how the propaganda works, especially in the US, you need to read the Luntz document. He's really clear that the occupation, and especially the settlements, are a problem. And he points to polls that show a large majority of Americans actually think that Israel should retreat to the 67 borders. In fact, he says, when you talk about land in terms of 67, you completely flip American sentiment against you. But, and this is his solution, if you bring up the danger of terrorism, you win back the support. The key, Luntz says, is to claim that the fight is over ideology, not land, about terror, not territory. In fact, these 3 words, terror, not territory, summarize the basis of the propaganda campaign in the US.
To strengthen the case that the conflict is about terrorism and not territory, Luntz points to the effectiveness of another well-established Israeli talking point, the claim that Israel gave up control of Gaza in 2005 in hopes of achieving peace and a 2-state solution, and got only rockets in return.
We left Gaza completely. We had Gaza, they could have turned it into a flourishing, wonderful place to live in. Look at what they did. They turned it into a haven of terrorists coming from all over the world.
It's completely untrue that Israel left the Gaza Strip. They did withdraw their colonists, but at the same time, they tightened their control over the Gaza Strip.
This is Gaza's main freight route into Israel, and normally this road would be bumper to bumper with heavily laden trucks. But it's completely closed, as is every other border crossing in the country. Nothing's coming into Gaza, and nothing is getting out.
So the idea that Israel left is 100% bogus.
Gaza remains occupied. Gaza has no control over its coast, over its waters, over its harbor, over its airspace, over the land or its borders, over its people. Who can come and go is totally at the Israeli discretion. In Gaza, there are constant military attacks by the Israeli Air Force, by drones. Targeted assassinations go on all the time.
It wasn't really a withdrawal, but the conventional shorthand in the media is that Israel was willing to give up an enormous amount to the Palestinian side, and the Palestinians responded with violence.
Israel, since 1967, controlled Gaza. They gave it to the Palestinians in a gesture of peace, and all they got are a bunch of rockets in return.
This is the basic frame of Israel's PR campaign. Make sure the media stays focused on terrorism and Hamas extremism as a source of the conflict, not the occupation and the settlements. If you want to see this in operation, just look at the coverage of any of Israel's many attacks on Gaza over the past few years.
Good evening. In the 60 years of conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, there have been few, if any, days like this one.
The scale and intensity of this attack was surprising. The deadliest operation against Palestinians in decades.
After an intense 3-week assault, 1,300 dead, 5,000 wounded.
In late December of 2008, Israel launched Operation Cast Lead, a massive ground and air assault on the Gaza Strip.
The Air Force released this cockpit video.
Over a period of 3 weeks, the Israeli military dropped over 600 tons of bombs on Gaza.
It isn't clear yet how many civilians are among the
Nearly 1,400 Palestinians were killed and thousands more injured.
The wounded were carried on corrugated iron, in private cars, on bats, and in arms. The worst one-day casualty toll in Gaza anybody can remember.
It was a brutal, murderous attack, devastating. This attack was murderous.
As with the Lebanon invasion 3 decades before, horrific images of destruction spilled onto television screens around the world. But this time the Israeli government was prepared. 6 months earlier, it had set up a new unit within the Israeli Prime Minister's office to help coordinate the government's messaging once the invasion started.
Israel is defending its action, saying this assault is in direct response to almost daily rocket and mortar attacks.
If you asked any American why that war started, they would say because the Palestinians started, firing rockets at Israel.
Hamas keeping up the rocket fire that triggered the Israeli attacks in the first place.
Hamas once again firing several dozen rockets into Israel today.
We were told endlessly in any media outlet you want to look at that Israel had to invade and attack the Gaza Strip because of an unending assault from Hamas and various militant groups in Gaza.
What are the goals of that operation right now?
To change totally the behavior of the Hamas. It's a terrorist regime that keeps shelling Israel with thousands of rockets and mortar shells.
What this forgets is that for the latter half of 2008, there was a very successful ceasefire that curtailed rocket fire into Israel dramatically, almost to the point at which there was none. This was shattered in November of 2008 when Israel attacked what they said was a tunnel building project, killed 6 Hamas militants. At that point, the ceasefire was off. Now, the New York Times, the so-called paper of record, reported this very clearly one time.
The story gets buried on page 8 of the New York Times and hardly registers anywhere else. Why? Well, look at the day